It always begins with something small. A letter taped to the door, printed on cheap office paper, but wrapped in the authority of the neighborhood's HOA. It fluttered in the September wind, and even before reading it, the homeowner knew it spelled trouble. These letters always did. The community had rules, and then it had rules. The written ones were strict enough. Lawns no longer than 2 inches, garbage bins hidden from street view, vehicles parked at designated angles only. But unwritten rules held even more weight, enforced by a board of self-appointed watchdogs who thrived on intimidation and busybody oversight. At the center of this network was a woman named Judith, though most people just called her the President. She walked with the air of someone guarding a royal court, clutching a clipboard like a weapon. The homeowner's son, Ryan, had just turned 16. He wasn't a troublemaker, though the HOA seemed to think otherwise. His hobbies were ordinary enough: waits in the garage, long runs through the neighborhood trail, spending afternoons sketching out designs for what he wanted to be one day, an engineer. But for the HOA, his very existence as a teenager was a disruption. His friends came over, they laughed too loudly, cars parked in front of the house for an hour or 2 at a time. And if the president of the HOA disliked one thing above all else, it was the presence of youth in a community she considered retirement-ready. The letter on the door was the 3rd warning in 2 months. The first one claimed the lawn was a 1/4 inch too long. The second accused the homeowner of excessive garage activity, whatever that meant. But this one was different. It wasn't about grass or cars or noise. It stated in cold, bold lettering, "Your son is attracting an inappropriate crowd. We have reason to believe suspicious activity is occurring at your residence. The HOA has notified local authorities." Reading it, the homeowner's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a warning. It was an escalation, a threat disguised as concern. The HOA was stepping into territory that had nothing to do with landscaping or paint colors. They had involved the police. That night, sitting in the living room, the weight of it all sank in. Ryan was upstairs finishing homework, oblivious to the storm brewing outside his window. The house, a modest 2-story with a flag in the yard and flowers by the porch, had become a target simply because a teenager lived there, simply because the wrong people had power and the boredom to abuse it. And what the HOA didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that the crowd visiting Ryan was not what they thought at all. It wasn't delinquent friends or shady strangers. It was men who carried themselves with a quiet confidence. Men who arrived in pickup trucks or nondescript SUVs. Men who knocked respectfully at the door before stepping inside with duffel bags slung over their shoulders. They were Navy SEALs. The connection was simple enough. Ryan's uncle, David, had served with them before his retirement. They had taken a liking to the teenager, mentoring him, guiding his workouts, teaching him discipline and resilience far beyond his years. Every so often, a few would stop by when passing through town. They trained in the garage, gave Ryan pointers, ate dinner with the family. To the untrained eye, perhaps, it might have looked suspicious. Broad-shouldered men carrying gear, lingering late into the evening. But to anyone who knew the truth, it was nothing less than an honor. The HOA, of course, knew nothing of this. To them, appearances mattered more than reality. And so, when a board made up of retirees and self-important rule enforcers decided that the presence of men visiting a teenage boy was a cause for alarm, they didn't ask questions. They called the police. That weekend, the tension reached a boiling point. A patrol car slowed outside the house, headlights washing across the windows. The homeowner peered through the blinds, pulse racing. The officer inside seemed hesitant, radio in hand, surveying the property. Across the street, Judith stood at the edge of her driveway, arms folded, lips curved in a self-satisfied smirk. She had orchestrated this. Inside, the family sat in silence. They had done nothing wrong. No laws were broken, yet the feeling of being hunted, of being watched, gnawed at the edges of peace. Ryan, unaware of the letter, asked why the lights were outside. His parents exchanged a glance and told him it was nothing. But they knew it was not nothing. It was just the beginning. Because once the HOA takes a step like that, they rarely step back. They double down. They escalate. And if they believed they had power by summoning the local police, they hadn't yet seen what real power looked like when men of discipline Men of service decided they'd had enough. The next morning, another SUV pulled up to the house. Inside were 3 of the SEALs who often visited. Their timing could not have been more perfect. They walked up the driveway, gear slung casually, nodding at the homeowner who greeted them at the door. From across the street, Judith watched, phone already in her hand, recording, whispering into it as though she had stumbled upon some criminal sting operation. But what she was actually witnessing was something she could never comprehend. The calm presence of warriors, men who had seen more than she could ever imagine, now stepping quietly into a suburban home to encourage a young man's dreams. The HOA thought they had the upper hand. They thought their word, their accusations, and their petty rules would be enough to scare a family into submission. What they didn't know was that they had just walked straight into a battle they were woefully unprepared to fight, and so the stage was set. The HOA had called the cops. The SEALs had arrived, and the homeowner, caught between suburban politics and the honor of those who served, realized this was no longer just about letters on the door. It was about standing firm, about drawing a line, and about showing the entitled few what happens when their power games collide with people who won't be pushed around. The letter had started it. But what came next would shake the entire neighborhood. The HOA believed themselves untouchable. In their eyes, the bylaws were more than rules. They were weapons, sharpened over years of petty disputes and endless committee meetings. They could cut down any opposition with citations, fines, and harassment dressed up as community standards. They had driven families out before, new parents who dared leave toys in their yard, dog owners whose pets barked too loudly, anyone who didn't bend to the clipboard brigade. This time, however, the HOA had no idea what they had unleashed. The morning after the police car slowed outside the house, whispers moved through the neighborhood. Judith, the self-proclaimed queen of the subdivision, stood at the center of it all, telling anyone who would listen about her discovery. She claimed suspicious men were frequenting the house. She claimed the teenager was up to no good. She even hinted at drugs, crime, and undesirable influences. For the HOA board, those accusations were enough. They drafted fines, drafted warnings, and plotted how best to corner the family. But what they didn't realize was that their first attempt at intimidation, the patrol car, had already backfired. The officer who had been dispatched wasn't just any cop. He was a veteran, a man who recognized the posture and discipline of the visitors walking into the house. He hadn't filed the kind of report Judith hoped for. Instead, he'd made a quiet note in his log, something about no cause for concern, routine observation. Then he'd driven off, leaving Judith fuming in her driveway. She wanted scandal. She wanted headlines. What she got was nothing. Still, the HOA pressed on. That Saturday, they called an emergency meeting, inviting only their most loyal followers. Neighbors trickled into Judith's living room, where cookies and coffee sat untouched on the table. With a dramatic flair, Judith played snippets of phone recordings she had taken. Muffled voices, heavy footsteps, doors closing. Out of context, they sounded ominous. In reality, it was nothing more than men arriving and leaving like anyone else would. But to her audience, Judith spun a narrative. "Look at this," she insisted. "Suspicious characters coming in and out at all hours. Something's happening in that garage. And if we don't act, property values will drop." That last line was always the clincher. Property values? For many of these homeowners, the phrase triggered fear like nothing else. They nodded along, convinced action was needed. The HOA voted unanimously to escalate further. They would request another police visit, file a formal complaint, and slap the family with fines that would make them reconsider living there at all. Yet outside that living room, the truth was unfolding in ways the HOA couldn't control. Because while Judith schemed, the SEALs were already aware of the situation. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Carter, had caught Judith recording them on her phone the day before. He hadn't said anything. SEALs rarely wasted words, but he had noticed. And when the men sat around the kitchen table that evening, he leaned in and told the homeowner not to worry. "We've handled worse. It wasn't bravado. It was fact. These were men trained to operate in hostile environments, to adapt to chaos, to stand their ground under pressure most people could never comprehend. To them, an overbearing HOA president with a clipboard wasn't a threat. She was a nuisance. But if she pushed too far, if she tried to weaponize the system against an innocent family, they wouldn't stand idle. That weekend, the visits continued. Trucks pulled into the driveway. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Judith scribbled notes, her paranoia growing with each passing hour. And then came the moment she thought would be her triumph. 2 police cruisers pulling up with lights flashing. Neighbors spilled onto porches, eager for a show. Judith strutted across her lawn, waving her arms, pointing at the house. The officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts, approaching the door with measured caution. But the second the door opened, the situation shifted. Inside, the SEALs stood calm and composed. Identification was offered, not fake, not flimsy, but official. The kind of credentials that made officers pause, straighten up, and exchange glances of sudden recognition. Within minutes, the entire tone changed. The police weren't there to arrest anyone. They weren't there to lecture. Instead, they ended up apologizing for the inconvenience, explaining that they had been told vague reports of suspicious activity. The SEALs nodded politely, saying nothing more than what was necessary, and then, in full view of the HOA president and her followers, the officers shook hands with the visitors, thanked them for their service, and walked back to their cruisers without another word. The scene left Judith stunned. The show she wanted had evaporated in front of her eyes. Instead of a family humiliated, she had witnessed law enforcement defer to the very people she wanted to paint as criminals. But humiliation has a way of hardening into anger. And in that moment, Judith made a choice. She wouldn't back down. She would dig in deeper. She would find another angle, another tactic, another way to rid the neighborhood of what she considered a stain. Back inside the house, the family sat around the table, uneasy but reassured. The SEALs didn't gloat, didn't laugh, didn't even acknowledge the theatrics outside. For them, it was routine. For the homeowner, though, it was personal. These were neighbors weaponizing authority, dragging a teenager's name through the mud and trying to intimidate them into silence. The battle lines were drawn. The HOA had shown they would escalate. The SEALs had shown they wouldn't be intimidated. And Ryan, sitting quietly in the corner, realized something important. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about principle. About whether bullies with clipboards could dictate the life of a family in their own home. By Sunday evening, Judith was already drafting the next letter. This one would accuse the family of creating an unsafe environment for the neighborhood. She intended to send copies to every house in the subdivision, rallying the community against them. It was a new level of warfare, one designed to isolate and shame. What she didn't understand, what she couldn't possibly predict, was how spectacularly this plan would backfire. Because when you drag the name of a Navy SEAL through the mud, you're not just picking a fight with a single family. You're picking a fight with a brotherhood. And that was a battle the HOA was destined to lose. The storm was gathering. And by the time the next week rolled around, the entire neighborhood would witness a clash unlike anything they had ever seen before. Judith was not a woman who accepted defeat easily. The humiliation of watching the police shake hands with the SEALs had seared into her pride like salt into an open wound. She had expected handcuffs, headlines, whispered gossip that validated her suspicions. Instead, she had been left standing in her driveway, powerless, with neighbors silently questioning her credibility. For someone like Judith, power was everything. And when power slips, the only option is to seize more of it. By Monday morning, she had already shifted tactics. Instead of relying on police reports or official citations, she went after the court of public opinion. She composed a long, rambling email addressed to every resident in the subdivision. Subject line in all caps, urgent community alert, unsafe activity on our street. In it, she described men loitering around the neighborhood, entering a particular house with bags, leaving late at night, sometimes arriving before dawn. She painted a picture of secrecy, of danger, of potential gang involvement. She never named the family outright, but everyone knew exactly who she meant. The email dripped with insinuations, carefully worded enough to avoid libel but sharp enough to turn heads. By noon, phones buzzed across the community. Neighbors forwarded the message, adding their own commentary. Some believed her without question. Others frowned, skeptical after witnessing the calm handshake between police and the supposed criminals. But gossip doesn't need truth, it only needs fuel. And Judith had thrown gasoline on the fire. At the same time, she plastered notices on the HOA bulletin boards by the clubhouse and the pool. Neighborhood safety concerns, they read in bold. Be vigilant. Report unusual activity. The implication hung heavy in the air. There was a threat among them, and it lived on that quiet cul-de-sac where the teenager resided. The family felt it immediately. Passing cars slowed more often. Neighbors who once waved now averted their eyes. At the grocery store, whispers trailed behind them. Ryan, just 16, noticed the shift most of all. Friends at school asked if he was in trouble. Parents pulled their kids away from him in the parking lot. It wasn't just an attack on his family anymore, it was an attack on his reputation. Inside the house, the atmosphere tightened. The homeowner's frustration simmered. Each letter, each glance from across the street, each whisper carried weight. And yet through it all, the SEALs remained steady. They came and went as usual, unconcerned with neighborhood politics. To them, this was noise. To the family, it was a storm. And then, just when things couldn't seem worse, Judith escalated again. She called for an open HOA meeting, scheduled for Friday evening in the community clubhouse. Her plan was clear: rally the homeowners, present her twisted narrative in person, and push for a formal vote to impose steep fines or even start legal proceedings against the family. It was the HOA's version of a trial, public, performative, and designed to humiliate. The news spread quickly. Flyers appeared in mailboxes. Posts circulated on the neighborhood's private Facebook group. Concerned neighbors left comments stoking fear, while others defended the family, urging everyone not to jump to conclusions. The stage was set for confrontation. On the day of the meeting, the parking lot outside the clubhouse overflowed. Cars lined the street, residents eager to witness the spectacle. Inside, folding chairs filled every corner, the air thick with anticipation. Judith stood at the front, clipboard in hand, wearing a blazer as though she were presiding over a courtroom. Her supporters flanked her, nodding solemnly, ready to applaud at the right moments. The family arrived quietly, slipping into seats near the back. With them were two of the SEALs, silent, watchful, their presence alone enough to draw stares. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Judith's eyes narrowed, but she forced a smile, determined not to lose control of the narrative. The meeting began with routine business, budget updates, landscaping contracts, community pool hours. But everyone knew what they were there for. Finally, Judith cleared her throat, tapping her clipboard for attention. "There have been troubling reports," she began, voice carrying through the microphone. She recited her list of grievances: strange vehicles, heavy bags, late-night gatherings. Each point was delivered with dramatic flair, designed to elicit gasps from the audience. She spoke of potential criminal elements, of danger to children, of the moral obligation the HOA had to act. When she finished, the room buzzed with murmurs. Some nodded, convinced. Others glanced uneasily at the family in the back. Then, unexpectedly, one of the SEALs stood. He didn't introduce himself with titles or stories. He simply stated calmly who he was and who his brothers were. He explained, without embellishment, that they were veterans, that they mentored the teenager, that their visits were nothing more than training sessions and meals shared in friendship. The room fell silent. The weight of his words cut through Judith's theatrics like a blade. People shifted in their seats, embarrassed at how quickly they had bought into gossip. A few even clapped softly, though most stayed quiet, caught between fear of Judith's wrath and admiration for the truth that had just been laid bare. Judith's face hardened. She tried to regain control, sputtering about unverified claims and protecting the neighborhood. But the moment had slipped. The narrative she had spent weeks building collapsed in the span of 2 minutes. Still, she refused to admit defeat. When the meeting adjourned, she announced that the board would review all available options and continue to investigate. But the cracks were showing. Neighbors left the clubhouse whispering, some angry at Judith for misleading them, others too embarrassed to meet the family's eyes. For the homeowner, it felt like a small victory. But victories in HOA wars are rarely final. That night, back at her house, Judith sat at her desk with the glow of her laptop casting sharp shadows on her face. She typed furiously, not an email this time, but a report, one she intended to send beyond the neighborhood, to city officials, to anyone who would listen. She had lost ground, but she would not lose the war. In her mind, she was the protector of the community. And protectors don't quit. The family, meanwhile, returned home exhausted but relieved. For the first time, the truth had been spoken aloud. For the first time, the neighborhood had seen through the smoke and mirrors. Yet in the quiet hours of the night, a question lingered. How far would Judith go? The answer was coming. And it would take the conflict from whispers and letters into full-blown spectacle, one that would draw in forces far beyond the borders of their quiet suburban street. For a few brief days after the clubhouse meeting, the neighborhood felt almost calm. Judith had taken a blow to her credibility, and whispers circulated that maybe she had gone too far. Some residents even approached the family with awkward smiles and small gestures of support, apologies without ever saying the word. For once, the air felt lighter, but calm in an HOA war is never permanent. It's only the quiet before the next strike. Judith had retreated but not surrendered. She knew the open meeting had been a disaster, yet her stubbornness burned hotter than ever. She wasn't just angry at the family now, she was humiliated. And humiliation demands retaliation. She began gathering evidence. Every time a SEAL's truck parked in the driveway, she snapped photos. When duffel bags were carried inside, she filmed from behind her curtains. She logged dates and times, creating a spreadsheet that looked more like the obsessive notes of a detective than a neighborhood concern. But to Judith, this was her case, and she would prove it no matter what. Her next step was bold, too bold. She convinced the board to authorize a private security company to monitor suspicious activity. A patrol car, not police this time but hired guards, began cruising the street, stopping outside the family's house for long stretches. Their presence was unsettling, the kind designed to make someone feel guilty even when they had done nothing wrong. The guards were young, underpaid, and unaware of what they had stepped into. One evening, they parked across the street as Ryan and two SEALs unloaded weights from a truck into the garage. The guards got out, flashing lights, demanding to know what was in the bags. What happened next spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The SEALs didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't even raise their voices. They simply stood their ground, explaining calmly that the guards had no authority to search anything on private property. One of them, with a presence that carried more weight than any badge, told the guards to call their supervisor. Within minutes, the guards were on the phone, shifting uncomfortably, realizing they had overstepped. When their supervisor arrived, it was clear even he wanted nothing to do with what Judith had set in motion. He ordered his men back in the car, apologized to the family, and left. But Judith wasn't finished. If outside pressure wouldn't break them, she would weaponize the rules themselves. The following week, the family received a notice in the mail, fines totaling over $2,000. The charges were laughable: improper storage of equipment, unapproved exterior activity, unauthorized traffic to residents. Each one carried a heavy penalty, stacked deliberately to hurt. It was financial warfare, the HOA's sharpest blade. The homeowner stared at the letter, anger simmering. This wasn't about lawns or parking anymore. This was targeted harassment, plain and simple. But before he could even draft a response, the SEALs stepped in. Because for them, this wasn't just harassment of a family they cared about. This was dishonor. And dishonor wasn't something they let slide. One of the SEALs made a few calls. Within days, letters arrived, not from the HOA, but from attorneys. Real ones. The kind that didn't mince words. They accused the HOA of harassment, defamation, and misuse of funds. They demanded a halt to all fines until the accusations could be proven in court. The board, unused to being challenged, panicked. They weren't accustomed to real opposition. Most families either paid up or moved out. But now, for the first time, their threats had been met with legal force. Judith, however, doubled down yet again. She called an emergency board meeting, insisting that the family's dangerous guests were undermining community safety. She suggested filing a lawsuit of their own, even hinting at involving Child Protective Services. Her rhetoric grew more extreme with each passing day, her paranoia bleeding into every word. The other board members shifted uneasily. They had joined the HOA to protect their investments, not to wage war against veterans. But Judith's grip was iron. She bullied them into compliance, threatening to expose their own minor violations if they didn't back her. Fear kept them in line, even as their confidence in her leadership crumbled. And then came the moment that crossed every line. Late one Friday night, while the family sat inside sharing dinner, headlights washed across the yard. A tow truck rolled slowly to a stop. Without knocking, without warning, the driver hooked the homeowner's vehicle, a perfectly legal, properly parked SUV, and began to haul it away. Ryan rushed to the window, eyes wide. The SEALs were already on their feet, moving with swift, silent precision. They stepped outside, calm but firm, demanding to know who had authorized the tow. The driver, nervous under their gaze, admitted it was a directive from the HOA. The SEALs instructed him to unhook the vehicle immediately. At first he refused, muttering about contracts. But when one of the men leaned in close, speaking in a low, steady tone that carried the unmistakable weight of authority, the driver faltered. Hands shaking, he lowered the SUV back onto the pavement and drove away without another word. Neighbors had watched the whole thing from behind curtains and porches. Some gasped, some whispered, but everyone knew. The HOA had gone too far. That night, the homeowner sat at the kitchen table with the SEALs, the letter of fines spread out beside him. He was exhausted, angry, ready to give up, but the SEALs weren't. To them, this wasn't over. This was the turning point, because if the HOA wanted a war, they were about to get one. And this time, the battlefield wouldn't be one-sided. Judith had crossed the line with her false accusations, her harassment, and now her attempt to take property by force. And when lines are crossed against men who have spent their lives standing on them, defending them and fighting back when others push, there's no going back. The battle was no longer about a teenager or a family. It was about justice, about teaching the HOA and Judith that abuse of power always comes with consequences, and those consequences were coming faster than anyone in that neighborhood could imagine. The morning after the attempted tow, the neighborhood was buzzing. Word had spread fast. Judith had authorized a truck to take the family's SUV, and only the intervention of the mysterious men inside the house had stopped it. Neighbors debated in hushed tones, weighing their loyalties. Some whispered admiration for the SEALs' calm authority, others muttered about troublemakers. But for the first time, the HOA's power felt shaky. The family, though, was still shaken. Ryan's father sat at the table, stacks of letters and fines piling up like a mountain of stress. It was the kind of pressure meant to grind people down, to make them either pay or leave. And for most families, that strategy worked. But this family wasn't alone. The SEALs had seen enough. To them, the HOA wasn't just a nuisance anymore, it was an aggressor. And aggressors had to be dealt with. They didn't storm into meetings or shout across lawns. That wasn't their way. Instead, they began with quiet precision, the same way they handled everything else. One of them contacted an attorney who specialized in HOA abuse cases. Another reached out to a journalist he knew, someone who had covered stories of neighborhood power gone wrong. A third began collecting every piece of evidence, every letter, every recording, every photo of guards and tow trucks. Where Judith had operated with gossip and intimidation, the SEALs operated with discipline and facts. They built a case brick by brick until it formed a wall too high for the HOA to climb. At the same time, they made their presence in the neighborhood impossible to ignore. Trucks parked in the driveway without apology. They jogged with Ryan through the streets, their steady pace and unmatched endurance a silent reminder of who they were. They carried themselves with calm confidence, their very posture enough to make anyone think twice before raising a complaint. Neighbors noticed. Some began to rethink their loyalties. The image Judith had painted of criminals skulking in and out no longer matched what they saw. They saw discipline, respect, men who waved politely, who mowed the family's lawn when schedules were tight, who carried groceries in without being asked. Slowly, quietly, the tide of public opinion shifted. Judith noticed too, and it enraged her. Each time she looked out her window and saw Ryan jogging alongside men who could have been carved from stone, she seethed. Each time she spotted neighbors chatting with them at the mailbox, her grip on control loosened. So she doubled down. She filed another round of fines, this time totaling over $4,000. She sent certified letters threatening liens on the house. She even hinted at foreclosing if the family didn't comply. It was nuclear escalation, and she thought it would scare them into retreat. But when the letter arrived, the family didn't panic. The seals were ready. The attorney fired back immediately. The fines, he argued, were baseless. The threats of foreclosure, illegal. He drafted a counterclaim accusing the HOA of harassment, defamation, and misuse of community funds. The legal papers were hand-delivered to the board, each member forced to sign for them. For the first time, the board members looked nervous. Judith had led them into battle, but now they were being named in the fight. Meanwhile, the journalist began making calls. She spoke with neighbors, gathered copies of letters, and pieced together a story that painted the HOA in a very different light. A story not of a troubled family, but of an entitled board abusing its power to target them. When word leaked that a major news outlet was sniffing around, panic spread through the HOA. Board members started questioning Judith openly. What if they print our names? What if the community gets sued? The same people who had cheered her on weeks earlier now whispered doubts behind her back. But Judith, too far gone to admit defeat, pressed harder. She accused the seals of orchestrating a smear campaign. She ranted at meetings, her voice rising, her words losing coherence. What had once been control now looked like desperation, and then came the moment that turned the tide completely. The seals organized a cookout. Nothing fancy, just burgers and hot dogs on a Saturday afternoon. But they invited the entire neighborhood. Some came reluctantly, others eagerly, but soon the cul-de-sac was filled with laughter and the smell of grilled food. Ryan tossed a football with friends again for the first time in weeks. Kids played tag on the lawn. Neighbors who had avoided the family finally approached, shaking hands, apologizing quietly for believing the worst. The seals mingled easily, telling light stories, never bragging, never explaining more than they had to. But their presence spoke volumes. These weren't criminals. These weren't threats. They were protectors, mentors, men who had bled for their country and now spent their time guiding a teenager who looked up to them. And as Judith stood at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, scowling at the gathering, the neighborhood finally saw the truth. It wasn't the family that was the problem. It was her. Still, she refused to back down. That evening, as the cookout wound down and neighbors drifted home with full stomachs and lighter hearts, Judith retreated inside and began writing again. This time, she wasn't writing to the neighborhood. She was writing to county officials, demanding intervention, claiming the HOA was under siege, painting herself as a victim. But what she didn't know was that her letters, her threats, and her desperation were already being documented by the attorney, by the journalist, by neighbors tired of her reign. She thought she was tightening her grip, but in reality she was digging her own grave. The seals had turned the tide. The neighborhood was shifting, and Judith, too blinded by her own ego to see it, was marching straight toward her downfall. The only question left was how spectacular that downfall would be. By the time the sun rose on the following week, the subdivision was no longer united under Judith's rule. The board that once clapped obediently at her every word now sat divided, worried about lawsuits, worried about their names being dragged through the mud. Neighbors who once believed her stories now saw her for what she was, a bully with a clipboard, drunk on power she never truly had. But Judith didn't see it. She couldn't. To her, the unraveling wasn't a sign of failure, but proof of conspiracy. She ranted in emails about infiltrators, about outsiders manipulating our peaceful community. She insisted that the SEALs were staging events to make her look bad. Her words grew more frantic, her tone more unhinged. Every message she sent only drove more people away. The real breaking point came when the journalist's article went live. The headline was simple, almost understated. HOA targets family. Veterans step in. But the story beneath it was damning. It chronicled the harassment, letters, fines, private security patrols, even the attempted tow. It quoted neighbors, some anonymous, some bold enough to go on record, describing Judith's obsession and abuse of power. And it ended with a photo taken at the cookout, Ryan smiling with his friends. A SEAL tossing a football, families gathered in the background. The article spread quickly, shared online far beyond the neighborhood's borders. Comments poured in, some furious, some supportive, but nearly all condemning the HOA's behavior. Suddenly, Judith wasn't just a neighborhood tyrant. She was a public embarrassment. The fallout was immediate. Calls flooded the HOA office. Some came from reporters asking for statements. Others came from residents in nearby communities outraged at the story. And then came the call Judith feared most, from the county office, announcing a formal investigation into HOA misconduct. Within days, board members began resigning. One after another, they stepped down, unwilling to be dragged into Judith's sinking ship. Without a quorum, the HOA was paralyzed. No fines, no enforcement, no power. For the first time in years, the community was free from her grasp. Judith, however, refused to accept it. She stormed through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, shouting at residents to remember who protected them. But now, instead of nods and forced smiles, she was met with closed doors and turned backs. Her authority had evaporated. The final blow came at a special meeting called by what remained of the board. With the county's oversight looming, they voted unanimously to remove Judith as president. A replacement was named. Someone quiet, level-headed, more interested in landscaping contracts than personal crusades. Judith's reign was over. When the announcement was made, the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. The tension that had hung heavy for months finally lifted. Kids played in the street again. Neighbors spoke freely without fear of being reported. And the family that had endured the worst of it finally stepped outside without feeling every eye upon them. For Ryan, the change was life-altering. He no longer carried the weight of rumors and suspicion. Friends came over without hesitation. His garage was once again filled with laughter, clanging weights, and the calm voices of men who taught him not just how to be strong, but how to stand tall in the face of adversity. The SEALs, for their part, faded back into their usual rhythm. They hadn't come for recognition or applause. They had simply done what they always did: protect those who needed it, stand firm against bullies, and leave situations better than they found them. Their quiet presence had reshaped the neighborhood more than Judith's years of barking orders ever had. As for Judith, her downfall was spectacular and complete. Without the presidency, she had no platform. Without the board, she had no backing. Isolated and exposed, she became a cautionary tale, whispered about at community barbecues and HOA gatherings in other towns. Some said she eventually moved away, unable to face the people she once lorded over. Others claimed she stayed, but her voice was never heard again in neighborhood meetings. In the end, the HOA war wasn't won with louder voices or harsher threats. It was won with patience, truth, and the quiet strength of men who had faced far greater battles. Judith had believed power came from clipboards and fines. The SEALs showed her that real power comes from discipline, honor, and the refusal to let injustice stand. And so, the quiet suburban street returned to normal. Lawns grew, children played, cars parked without fear of tickets. The family lived in peace once more, their bond with the SEALs stronger than ever. Ryan carried the lessons forward, not just about training or fitness, but about resilience, about how to face down bullies, whether on a battlefield or in a neighborhood meeting room. The HOA had sent cops. They had sent guards. They had even sent a tow truck. But what they didn't realize until it was too late was that they weren't just harassing a teenager. They were challenging Navy SEALs. And in that battle, there was only ever going to be one winner. And that, my friends, is how one HOA's petty war spiraled completely out of control. They thought they could scare a teenager, harass a family, and push people around with letters and fines. What they didn't count on was that his visitors weren't suspicious strangers at all. They were Navy SEALs. The HOA tried everything: police, private security, even a tow truck in the middle of the night. But every move only exposed their abuse of power and pushed the neighborhood further away. In the end, the president lost her crown. The board collapsed, and the family walked away stronger than ever. It just goes to show, bullies with clipboards might run a neighborhood for a while. But when their entitlement meets real discipline and honor, the outcome is never in their favor. So the next time an HOA president thinks they're above everyone else, maybe they should think twice. Because they never know who might be on the other side of that door. If you enjoyed this story and you think it deserves to be heard more than the HOA ever wanted, make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and of course, subscribe to HOA Story Files for more unbelievable HOA and entitled people drama. Your support helps these stories reach more people, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.